In our previous videos, we talked about the NLSAT examination, and in today's video, we are going to talk about the part B of the NLSAT examination. This part is extremely important because this is subjective in nature, which means that the analysis of this part is very important for people to understand. It's also important because I do not think that there are a lot of good material out in the market to actually tell you what analysis entails and what kind of mechanizations are important to go ahead and ace in this section, and that is why this video is extremely important. Just moving on to what are the general instructions for part B. Part B has 5 legal aptitude and reasoning problem based questions, and they are of 12 marks each, which means that there are 12 mark questions of 5 marks, which is equal to 60 marks. And after that, you have one essay based question, and this essay based question should not be more than 500 words, and this essay based question is of 15 marks. In this specific video, we are going to talk about the legal reasoning part, which was for 60 marks, and we're going to delve into a complete detail of what is required in part B legal reasoning aspect. One thing that is very important to understand is that this part does not require you to have prior knowledge of law. This is something that we've seen in videos of other coaching institutions where they go ahead and teach you certain wrong things. This has been cleared by NLS faculty in a lot of their own videos also, is that there is no prior knowledge of law required, which means that any kind of analysis that you do does not require you to have legal training of any sort. With that, it may be possible that legal principles may be mentioned, but these legal principles will be mentioned in the question itself, and you have to go ahead and analyze these principles just based on what is written in the question. So if we just have to take an example for part B, a legal principle states that a contract may be considered unenforceable if one party was induced to enter into it by a misrepresentation made by the other party, provided the misrepresentation was material and relied upon. If questions come which mention these legal principles in the first place, I think one very important thing to keep in mind is that you have to go ahead and incorporate the terms that have been mentioned in this question, which means that for a contract to be said to be unenforceable because of misrepresentation, there has to be misrepresentation that was material and relied upon, which means that these ingredients then have to be talked about in the question. Now, this is the question that is there. You can pause the video and read the entirety of question, but this question basically in the gist talks about how Arjun is an independent software developer. He goes and contracts to make an app for a company, but what happens is that there is no division of work specifically mentioned in the contract. The company later goes ahead and tells Arjun that, oh, you have to do both the front end and the back end work. And Arjun says that, no, I was given the assurance by the project developer that I only have to do the front end work. Which means, and therefore there is an issue here. You can read the question again by pausing this video. But the question then becomes is, should Arjun be allowed to rescind the contract? Rescind means cancel the contract based on TechWave's misrepresentation, right? And when you go ahead and answer these sort of questions, what we have seen in a lot of students writing in their mocks is that they go ahead and say that sure, Arjun should be allowed to rescind the contract because Arjun was given, because TechWave's project manager assured Arjun that their in-house development team would handle all back-end integration, and therefore Arjun would not have to do it, and that is why they say that's misrepresentation. But that is wrong, which means that, not wrong per se, but incomplete, which means that you also have to tell me the misrepresentation that was made in the first place was material and relied upon, right? What do we mean by material? When we go ahead and see the answer key for this, I think when we talk about material and relied upon, you have to use these keywords expressly in your response. You can go ahead and say that the misrepresentation was material as it indicated the nature of work that Arjun was expected to undertake, and it was relied upon as Arjun agreed to take up the work just on the basis of this. You can also state that this was relied upon because Arjun, based on this representation, hired other UI developers so on and so forth. Which means that you have to go ahead and show in your answer that all the ingredients that have been mentioned in the legal principle have been fulfilled. Moving on, there is another important thing that you have to do in these questions. Any question in part B has two sides, which means that there's not going to be a single question which does not have an other side. It is not tilted heavily towards only one side. There's always going to be a counter to the side. If you go back to the question, you will see what is the counter. The counter that we get from TechWave. So it says TechWave argued that Arjun's mismanagement and inexperience had caused the delay, and the fact that there is no clause in the contract which requires him to pay, there's a clause in the contract which requires him to pay a 20% penalty for early termination, but also the fact that when the contract that Arjun had signed, this contract specifically does not mention at any point of time any differentiation in the nature of work that Arjun is required to do. And that is why it's important that we have to go ahead and talk about this counterclaim in the first place, so as to then go ahead and make a complete answer. Which means that you also have to see the merit in the arguments that are being made by TechWave and then respond to that so that you can go ahead and do it. So if you see here, it says TechWave insisted that the contract had no mention of the specific division of responsibilities. What I've seen in mocks is that people forget this line. People forget to talk about the merit in TechWave's argument. It means that you have to mitigate the impact of the merit of the arguments that is there on the other side. So how can you do that? You can go ahead and say that sure, the contract does not mention any division of work, which means that there is some leeway into how you can go ahead and interpret that contract in the first place, right? And how you can do that? You can do that by saying that just because the contract does not mention a division of work does not mean that Arjun is required to do all the work, simply because of the fact that an assurance exists from the project manager, right? How you can develop this answer further is by talking about how a project manager is part of the upper management of a company and is therefore higher up in the company hierarchy. Moreover, he was designated by the company to negotiate the terms of the contract with Arjun and was therefore representing the company through his words and actions. It was therefore reasonable for Arjun to rely on this representation despite its absence from the written contract. The company undertook, there are other ways also that you can go ahead and respond to it. So which means that you can say the company undertook cost-cutting measures, as a result of which the in-house legal team was unavailable. This was entirely within the company's control and knowledge. Accordingly, it was the manager's burden to make accurate representations, keeping in mind the financial position of the company, right? You can see the answer key that I've prepared for this question. What this answer key entails is that when you're going ahead and seeing a question, you have to go ahead and see into the practical nuances of that question. A contract does not mention specific division of work, but there is oral representation by a project manager as to how that work is actually to be done, right? Now, I have made this specific form of analysis just to show that the project manager is not a normal associate in that firm whose representation does not matter. A project manager is very, very important, like holds an important position in that firm, and therefore the representation that he makes becomes extremely important, and it is very fair for Arjun to then go ahead and rely on such representation, right? You can also go ahead and say something on the lines of how the assurance given by the manager is sufficient to constitute misrepresentation, because there are certain terms which may arise through oral representation also, which means that representations are written, but representations can also be oral, right? Which means that if there is a lacuna in the written representation, you can go ahead and fill that with the oral representations that are there. I think these are more practical things that you bring into the question, because the examiner is wanting to see how well you can analyze a question, how much more nuance you can bring into that question, right? These are the things the examiner is wanting to see. We've seen so many videos out there where I think it's a bit misleading for other what other coachings do is that they tell you that go ahead and repeat facts and make a very superficial distinction between, okay, this should be there because ABC. I don't think examiners are looking for those superficial distinctions and superficial answers, and they're not looking for facts to be go ahead and like repeated within the question, at least insofar as it does not help you make an argument. That is why it's important to make analysis and nuances that other people might not be making. That is why another question that comes when we talk about this is that, oh, are we not assuming a lot of things when we are writing this answer? And the response to that is that we are not, which means that if a project manager is part of the upper management of the company, this is not an assumption, right? These are things that we gather from our daily experiences, right? Which means that you're not allowed to assume that the project manager is the head of the company and whatever he says goes. But it's very fair for you to assume that this person holds a position in the upper hierarchy of the company, right? That's not an assumption as long as that assumption is based on daily experiences that you see all around you. Moving forward, what are the other things that we have to go ahead and take care about? I do this again with an example. This question again has another legal principle. It talks about that a person is responsible for harm caused to another if they fail to take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions that could foreseeably cause injury or damage to that other person, especially when a special relationship or duty exists between them. I take this particular question simply because of the fact that this question has a lot of ingredients that you have to go ahead and mention within the answer key itself, right? Now we're going to read the entire question here just because I think that's very important. So Nidhi owns a multi-story apartment building in a bustling city. The building's elevator is old and prone to malfunctions. Several residents have previously reported irregular jerks, sudden stops, but Nidhi has postponed major repairs, citing high costs and inconvenience of long closures. One afternoon, Ramesh, an elderly tenant with limited mobility, he has limited mobility, he's an elderly tenant also, and he enters the elevator on the 8th floor. As the elevator descends, it suddenly halts between floors due to a mechanical failure. Trapped inside for over an hour in sweltering heat, Ramesh suffers severe anxiety and subsequent heart attack, requiring emergency hospitalization. Ramesh alleges that Nidhi's failure to maintain the elevator properly caused his injuries. Nidhi argues that she took reasonable steps by conducting routine checks and had planned a full repair the following month. Moreover, she contends that elevator malfunctions are unpredictable and that the emergency response protocols minimize the harm. Ramesh files a claim seeking compensation for medical expenses, emotional distress, and pain. Is Nidhi liable for injuries? So you have to go ahead and respond, is Nidhi liable for these injuries? Now, when you see this question, first thing that you have to see is that what is the principle for harm states? The principle for harm states that there should be a failure to take reasonable care, that these acts and omissions that caused this harm were foreseeable, and that the injury that is caused to others, especially when there is a special relationship of duty. So I think three broad principles exist here. First is that reasonable care should have been taken. Second is that these injuries should be foreseeable, and third is that a special relationship or duty should exist. Now, how will you go ahead and prove these ingredients? You can go ahead and talk about how there is failure to take reasonable care. Why is there failure to take reasonable care? Because these incidents were previously reported, these irregular jerks were already felt, but still Nidhi chose not to go ahead and and even then Nidhi chose to not go ahead and fix the elevator. That is the kind of problem which we can go ahead and attribute that she did not take reasonable care. Now, were these acts and omissions foreseeable? We can go ahead and state that by saying that yes, they were foreseeable simply because of the fact that the elevator is old and prone to malfunctions, which means that an old elevator is bound to have, like, mechanical failures, and therefore again these acts could have been easily avoided and they were quite foreseeable. And whether a special relationship or duty exists, of course, then you can go ahead and talk about how Nidhi owns a multi-story apartment, and this person Ramesh, who goes ahead and has a heart attack, is a tenant in that building, which means that a tenant, like a landlord and tenant relationship exists between Nidhi and Ramesh, and therefore a special relationship of duty exists, right? And therefore this is how you can, I think it is only to this extent that you reproduce facts within your question, only to go ahead and respond to the legal ingredients that I mentioned in the question. But what are the other things that you can go ahead and do to make this question like a perfect 12 on 12 is simply because of the fact that you also have to mitigate what Nidhi says. As I said in the previous slide, it's important to go ahead and respond to the other side also. So Nidhi's defense is that, oh, I did do routine checks and had planned to do a full repair the following month, and that elevator malfunctions are unpredictable. So you can go ahead and respond to these things by saying that, okay, going ahead and planning a full repair the next month is not enough reasonable care. You can go ahead and say that by trying to mitigate it. You can also go ahead and say that elevator malfunctions are not unpredictable. What Nidhi is claiming is untrue. Elevator malfunctions are quite predictable, especially because the elevator was old and prone. I'll just show you the answer key here, just so you all have a better understanding of what a good answer looks for this question. So just starting with, Nidhi is already aware of the demographic of the building, which means that she is already aware that elderly people stay in this building. These elderly people cannot take stairs, which means that these people will take elevators, to the point that she has already received complaints about the elevator not functioning properly. To that extent, if she does not go ahead and maintain these elevators, elderly people will still have to take them and they might face difficulties. But also the possibility that elderly people are more prone to having getting anxiety orders. They are already people who do not have the best of health, which means that you have to go ahead and keep in mind that there are special, like, people living with like special, which means that she has to go ahead and keep it in her mind that there are people who have like special needs, and these people reside in a building, and therefore she has to be a little bit more conscious of what she's doing. But I think you can also go ahead and say that the only reasons offered, high costs and long foreclosures, are insufficient when serious danger could result from the malfunction. You can say that emergency protocol is also inadequate because the tenant remained trapped for 1 hour. If the tenant has remained trapped for 1 hour, you cannot go ahead and say that emergency protocol was adequate, showing that response was neither prompt nor sufficient. Elevator malfunctions in this case was not unpredictable, as I said earlier also, given the fact that the elevator was old and prone to malfunctions. Now, I have also gone and shown that you can go ahead and like give an example, which means that a special duty exists, right? Which means that if a food delivery person comes to the building, maybe Nidhi's liability is not so much towards this person because this person is not a tenant in the building. Therefore, Nidhi cannot say that I owe something to this person, but because the person who actually got hurt is a tenant in the building, therefore the special duty relationship also gets fulfilled, right? Here I have given you a template also how to go ahead and like answer all questions. So you start from like facts and then arguments and then how it fulfills the legal ingredients, right? Example, the lift was prone to malfunctions and Nidhi had been made aware of the same through several complaints. That's the fact, right? Then she postponed repairs without any legitimate reason. This is the omission that she did. Thus, it was reasonably foreseeable that such malfunction may cause serious risk to elderly tenants. This is the injury part that is being completed, and they are more vulnerable residents, and therefore there is a special duty, and they're also prone due to old age health conditions, right? I think if you are able to succinctly articulate all the facts and legal ingredients in as less words as possible and the most articulate way as possible, I think this is something that's going to fetch you the best marks in passages or like legal reasoning. Now moving on to the next question, we go ahead and see other things, right? What are the other ways that you can make your answer from better to best? go ahead and incorporate your daily life experiences and think from a practical point of view, which means that whenever you see a question, think about what would I react if I were in the same situation. Now, going ahead and trying to understand what I've just stated through a question, the legal principle states that a manufacturer is liable for harm caused by defects in its products if the defect existed at the time the product left the manufacturer's control and the harm was a foreseeable consequence of the defect. Now, the question to that is that Ravi is an app developer who buys a new smart home device called HomeGuard, manufactured by SecureTech. HomeGuard is designed to integrate with household devices, allowing users to control their lights, locks, cameras remotely through a mobile app. A week after installation, Ravi notices that HomeGuard intermittently disables his front door's smart lock, leaving it unlocked at night. So Ravi has already noticed this. One night, while he and his family are asleep, a burglar enters through the unlocked door and steals valuables. The police investigation reveals that the problem was due to a software glitch in HomeGuard's firmware, which SecureTech had been aware of, which means that SecureTech was already aware of this glitch, but they had not fixed it before shipping. SecureTech argues that the product's user manual recommended regular software updates. Now, what is this? This is a user manual. User manual recommended regular software updates, and that Ravi had delayed updating the app, contributing to the problem. Ravi sues SecureTech for the losses, claiming that the product was defective. SecureTech defends itself, saying it provided the update instructions and disclaimers and that user negligence contributed to the problem. So now, should SecureTech be held liable for the harm caused? Now, what's important to understand in this question, that if you see the legal principle gets fulfilled quite easily in this question. There was a product, the defect in the product had already existed before the time it left the manufacturer's control, and the harm was obviously foreseeable because they obviously understand that using this product which has a software glitch will will go ahead and result in some harm. Now, the only way that you can respond when you're talking from SecureTech side, if you're taking SecureTech side, what you can go ahead and say is that the harm was not foreseeable because of the fact that two things, that Ravi had already noticed that HomeGuard is intermittently disabling, which means that he already knows that some glitch is already existing, which means that to the extent that he does not inform the company before or does not take measures to go ahead and solve the problem, he is also culpable to some extent. But they can go ahead and say that the harm was also not foreseeable simply because of the fact that we had already sent a user manual which had gone ahead and recommended regular software updates, and therefore since it is the user who did not do it, therefore the harm was not foreseeable for us. This is what SecureTech would argue. But I think if you are in this question, the best way to go ahead and answer it would be from Ravi's side. If you take Ravi's side, simply because of the fact that I think that side is much more stronger. Why? What are the reasons that I would say? Especially if you're taking Ravi's side, you should also mitigate, the kind of things that SecureTech would say when they are arguing, right? So an answer key to this would look something like, sure, firstly, that because SecureTech is doing, they sell appliances like locks for homes, right? Which means that they understand that the locks that they are selling are important to go ahead and secure very, very important things. Securing a home is extremely important in our daily lives. Our valuables are kept inside the home, but we ourselves stay inside the home, which means that safety and security of individuals is also something that SecureTech always has to keep in mind whenever they are selling a product, which means the gravity of the harm that can be caused, the potential harm that can be caused, has to be kept in mind, especially when you're trying to see if someone is culpable or not, right? So the answer key could say something like, a company cannot shy away from taking responsibility for making defective products by expecting the user to keep updating their appliances. They had the duty to be extra cautious as the appliances they sell are crucial for the safety of individuals, and that therefore there was no margin for error. They should have notified the user through a call or email and made sure that the user is aware of the glitch and that they need to update the product to rectify it. Now, this is the part where I say that bring in your own experiences. They say that, oh, you should have read the user manual and based on that user manual, you should have updated your product. but understand how many times products come in our home and how many times do we actually read that user manual, and how many times do we actually go ahead and incorporate everything that's written in a user manual. Even if we have an app on our phone, and even though there are a lot of things, like a lot of times we get a notification to update that app, we do not take these things so seriously in life. And that is why these are the things that you should incorporate into the answer, in the sense like what are the daily life experiences of people, and how do an average person reacts to user manuals, and how do average users react to updates that are getting. But an important thing is also to understand that there is no reasonable expectation on any person that if I don't update an app, something so harmful can happen to me, right? This is never an expectation, because you don't expect updates to go ahead and solve major problems, right? This is not something that's an expectation from an update. An update merely, and in most cases, only improves the software, right? And that is why it's important to understand that going ahead and making these claims are very bizarre in the first place. But one more thing that you can go ahead and talk about is the fact that user agreements usually run for pages, and it is widely known that users do not go through it. Now think about it, when you go ahead and log into Facebook or Instagram, they also have a user agreement. And by the way, that's very important, because a lot of your data is being, like, you're consenting for a lot of your data to be transferred because you're agreeing to these user agreements, right? But why are we as like individuals not more cognizant of it? It's simply because of the fact that because these user agreements, first of all, written in very tiny fonts, and they are run for pages, which means that people really do not have the time to go through it at length. People do not have that time in life in general, but also a lot of people are not literate enough in the first place to understand the legal language that is written in the user agreements. Legal language in general is quite difficult to understand, and therefore it's not possible for people to expect that like normal individuals will be able to understand that and incorporate that also. I think these are all things that you can bring in your answer. These are not assumptions. These are specifically your experiences that you can bring into the question when you're writing an answer. I remember actually for a fact that when I was writing NLSAT myself, I got in part B, I got like 51 out of 75 marks. And one of the questions actually mentioned something like Instagram has a user agreement, and therefore a person consents to it, and the data is then traveled. This came in NLSAT 2020, the NLSAT 2020 paper. And I wrote this exact reasoning in my part B. The fact that user agreements are long, that they run for pages, and that they're written in very small fonts, that they're written in legal language, and therefore it's very difficult for average individuals to understand it. It's also that a lot of people who use Instagram in the first place come from the age bracket of 18 to 24. All of these individuals at least also do not understand the gravity of like agreeing to these user agreements, right? They do not understand that there can be consequences to it, which means that the demographic of the people who opt into this app is also very important when you're going ahead and doing this, which means that you cannot go ahead and write very incriminating things in a user agreement and expect that, oh, I have done my part by informing the person. You have not done your part because you have not informed them through means which are understandable and legible for people. I think this is the kind of analysis that we're usually looking in NLSAT mocks. You can also go ahead and say that the recommendation to regularly update software is more in the nature of a boilerplate clause. A boilerplate clause is basically clauses that are always there in all kinds of contracts, right? So which means that you will always see these clauses and nobody takes them that seriously in the first place. And users do it at their own convenience and not as a mandatory thing. So to hinge the security of individuals on updates of an app is careless and negligent, right? So this is how you can go ahead and make this answer so much more nuanced rather than writing a very simple answer that, oh, Ravi should get compensated simply because of the fact that there was a defect and the manufacturer did not solve it before shipping. That is not the kind of answer we're looking for much more nuance in our answers. And this is something that I have seen that a lot of videos on NLSAT, at least for other coachings, do not specifically address the kind of nuances that are required. And that's why it's very important for you to go ahead and like understand how you can better your marks in these questions. Now, just on the last part, this is the last question we are going to do. I think this question is very important, simply because of the fact that when you're writing an answer, the examiner is also going ahead and seeing to what extent do you understand the gravity of situations that you're responding to, which means that just because you have to go ahead and take a stand, how you go ahead and tone your answers is also very important, which means that you have to respond to the sensitivity of the question at all points of time. Now, this question is based on sexual harassment, and that is why I'm just going to read it out loud for you. The legal principle says that a person has the right to use reasonable force in self-defense against an imminent threat of harm, but the force used must be proportionate to the threat faced. The keyword being proportionate, right? Now, if you go ahead and read this question, it says that Lena is a young researcher who had previously experienced a violent mugging in the same area a year earlier in returning home late at night after a conference dinner. And she feels nervous as she walks through a poorly lit alley known for occasional petty crime. Halfway through, she hears hurried footsteps behind her and she sees a tall man, Samir, dressed in dark clothes, moving quickly in her direction. Her heart races as she recalls the past assault. She grips her small pocket knife in her coat pocket, a precaution she carries since the mugging. Samir, in his late 30s, is a local construction worker who had just finished a long shift. He notices Lena drop her conference badge and had picked it up, and he just wants to give it back to her. So he's wanting to return it and he calls out, "Excuse me, miss," and he jogs to catch up with Lena. But hearing footsteps and a voice behind her, she quickens her pace, and when she glances over her shoulder, she sees Samir's silhouette getting closer, and therefore she's panicking and she's recalling her previous attack. And as Samir gets close enough to reach out, Lena spins around and instinctively slashes at his forearm with her pocket knife, and Samir screams in pain, drops the badge, and basically what happens later is that once she realizes that he was actually just going ahead and like trying to help her, therefore she takes him to the hospital also, and that Samir obviously sues her, and then Lena says that, "Oh, I was just trying to like use self-defense because of my past trauma," right? And that is why when you go ahead and see this paper, once you go ahead and see this paper, what you will realize is that a lot of people, when they've attempted this question, either they go ahead and say things like, because so many factors were present, poor lit alley, feeling nervous, already a past assault is there, and the fact that Samir is jogging towards her, so many things are happening. Therefore, it is very natural for Lena to go ahead and feel this kind of fear, and therefore it's very natural for her to go ahead and like use self-defense by using this pocket knife. The other side of the answers that we're getting is that what Lena is doing is an overreaction. He was just trying to help her, and therefore once she uses the pocket knife, it's an overreaction. She should not have done it, right? And I think both these answers are to very great extents incomplete, right? Whenever you're writing an answer, you have to respond to both sides, right? So it's not that when you're writing for one side you forget the other side, right? So when you're writing an answer like this, it should start from something like that. While it is very understandable why Lena reacted the way she reacted, which means that she has gone through a lot of trauma in the past, and this is a poor lit alley, and because of so many reasons, why she feels the fear inside her is very natural, and we understand that. But the importance of, but even then, if you're saying that she is responsible, then you can go ahead and say the fact that Lena's actions were driven by a genuine and understandable panic. This does not meet the threshold of self-defense, right? Which means that you can get a lot of questions in which you understand that there is merit on the other side, but that merit does not mean that it is fulfilling the threshold of the kind of charge that you're trying to prove again, right? Which means that you can merit the other side but still say that it does not meet the threshold. So for self-defense to kick in, the harm should have materialized in the first place, right? And anticipation of that harm is not enough. Since the harm had not materialized, which means that actual harm has not happened, therefore you cannot go ahead and say this. Lena's past trauma could have led her to believe that there was imminent harm. However, in law, there should be an objective standard of what an imminent harm is, which means that today, if I am a person who has faced a lot of trauma, maybe I am a person who has been mugged in daylight by maybe by people who've been driving very fast on a bike, and maybe they have thrashed, maybe stolen a chain from my neck. Maybe that's a trauma that I have in the past. Does it mean that every time that I'm out on the road and if someone, walks past me very, very quickly, do I go ahead and like beat them or thrash them because I expect that they might go ahead and steal again from me? No, right? It means that these are individual circumstances, and law cannot have a standard based on subjective feelings, right? Tomorrow I can go ahead and I can do a crime and say that, oh, I had a past trauma. But how do you go ahead and prove that, right? Which means that you have to understand that can law have an objective standard in the first place, or can law develop subjective standards for like different individuals, right? So that is why the right of self-defense cannot become a justification for preemptive aggression. This can turn into a dangerous precedent based on subjective fears. If subjective trauma could be a metric for imminent harm, innocent bystanders could be harmed routinely under the guise of self-defense. Though Leena helped Sameer afterwards, her subsequent conduct cannot retrospectively justify her initial unlawful use of force. This is how you write an answer, because you bring in all aspects of the answer into the question. You don't go ahead and isolate different arguments just based on what suits your answer the best. You have to treat the entire question in entirety. In the same breath, I would say that even if you go ahead and say that Reena is not responsible, how can you frame that kind of a question? You can go ahead and analyze that question in the way that law needs to have standards which are cognizant of the country we live in, the city we live in, the gender that I belong to, and the kind of experiences that women in general have within that city and within that country. Which means that because in this question, because that is an area in which assaults have happened a lot in the past, and because women in general are extremely unsafe in the country, it's very important for the law to respond to how women react and how women's fears develop. Which means that if I believe that self-defense kicks in because I feel that the harm is materialized already, right? Someone does not need to actually go ahead and try and assault me for me to think that the harm is materialized. For me, harm is materialized the moment someone is jogging towards me, because in countries like these which are extremely unsafe, that should be the threshold of harm in the first place, right? That is also something that you can go ahead and respond to if you're saying that Leena is not responsible. You can go ahead and talk about the fact that if the law can have a reasonable man stance, but then the law should also see what is reasonable for a woman in the first place, right? So even though there cannot be like different standards for different individuals, there can definitely be different standards for different classes of individuals, which means that men can be treated differently and women can be treated differently simply because their experiences are extremely different. I think this is how you can go ahead and tackle different kinds of questions in part B. I think with that, we're going to end the session, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.